Welcome to Windows on the World. What a packed show we've got for you tonight. And first of all, before I introduce our guests and talk about the main subject for tonight, I'd like to tell you about next weekend's shows. Yes, The Bigger Picture, featuring myself, Piers Corbyn and Sandi Adams, the Global Local Agenda Explained, Saturday 17th of November, 12 a.m. till 6 p.m, St Sebastian Centre, Douglas Green, Salford in Manchester. Tickets are available at windowsontheworld.net. And on Sunday, the 18th of November, the day after Saturday, 12 till 6 again, we will be at New Horizons in Lytham St Anne's. I've spoken there before. Brilliant audience, great venue, very nice people. And we will be again talking about the bigger picture on Sunday, the 18th. On Monday the 19th, I'm going to stay over and do a little bit of a talk, probably on my own unless anyone stays over for the Monday, to again the same group, New Horizons in Lytham St Anne's, Living Beyond the Post-Truth World, which goes into the remedies that I've found over the years for dealing with bureaucracy, and that should be of interest to most people in the present climate. Now, climate, that's the subject of tonight's show. We're going to be talking about climate change, and we're going to be talking about those who want to control the narrative of public opinion through this agenda. Now, also I'd like to say that if anybody can help us to keep us going, please go to the site if you enjoy our work and do press the donate button, throw a few pennies in the hat, or indeed make a regular subscription. It really helps because we do have a lot of expenses and we're doing a lot of travelling now. So that sort of helps to pay for the increasing costs of Windows on the World. And also, if you're interested in documentaries, on the homepage of Windows on the World, you'll find links to download films. I'm going to be putting more films there in the future, and we're working on one at the moment, which most of our listeners will find of interest. But if you like early 60s music, and you're interested in that early British rock and roll wave which followed the skiffle scene, then have a look on the homepage of windowsontheworld.net. There's a great film on there about a very enigmatic and interesting character who brought the bass guitar to the UK, the electric bass guitar. That was Jet Harris, the original Shadows bass player, and that's available on Payloads on the front page of the site. All this, of course, helps us to bring you the information that we want to bring you. So, let's get on with it. We're going to talk about infiltration tonight. A definition of to infiltrate is to pass troops singly or in small groups through gaps in the enemy line, to enter or become established in gradually or unobtrusively, usually for subversive purposes, i.e. the intelligence staff had been infiltrated by spies, or in actual fact the intelligence staff had infiltrated citizen groups up and down the country. This is what's going on with us in the UK. I've been covering it for years, and we're going to get into that tonight with Piers Corbyn, Francis Leader and Sandi Adams. So the most effective way to take over a country, corporation or business is to infiltrate from within. It is the tactic by which all objectives are in time achieved. This is the method used by experts such as the KGB and advocated by the Frankfurt School, also known as the Institute for Social Research, and later by Saul Alinsky and his rules for radicals, which are heralded as the new rules for the big society. That was from 2010 in the UK. David Cameron actually advocated using Saul Alinsky rules for radicals, which can be used for good or bad purposes, but generally we're seeing them used for subversive purposes. So look up Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals on the internet and you will get an idea of how this controlling of the narrative is happening in most organisations in the country. So in actual fact, the UK is under ideological subversion. We have covered in great detail this over many shows and with many examples of how it's being implemented. So the narrow opinion corridor is now policed by intolerance. I think I should read that again. The narrow opinion corridor is now policed by intolerance. And I think most people who listen to this show are in full agreement with that. So think tanks link into other NGOs and organisations for psychological programming, such as the Tavistock Institute, and also referred to as Freud's Front Room. That's the Tavistock Institute. We've reported on that in our previous shows. And one of the organisations that's linked to the Tavistock Institute and the British Psychological Association is called Demos, a think tank who are injecting ideology into our media. Now, the quote from Demos, which I've read out many times, I put it in my talk actually because it's quite chilling. Demos are directly linked to MI5, and they stated several years ago that the new democracy, get this, the new democracy will work with a combination of government open infiltration and citizen groups taking direct action. Now, what can they mean by that? The new democracy. I thought we already had democracy. Apparently not. It will work with a combination of government open infiltration. And that's what we're going to be talking about in tonight's show. So the new democracy will work with a combination of government open infiltration and citizen groups. Now, who are these citizen groups? We've reported on that. I did an article called Big Society Change Agents. The Big Society was to change society and inject change agents into society at every level. That's why local people who contact me from their local areas will actually tell me that they have no input and they're being steered into predetermined outcomes with no choice. So those citizen groups are the fake activist agendas of climate change. This is very interesting. This is at the head of it all. Everything has to revolve around this agenda because this climate change agenda is one of control and co-opting people into accepting absolute subservience and slavery. Does that sound like a conspiracy theory? Well, listen to some of our previous shows and look at the evidence, not the rhetoric, the evidence. So let's look at how Occupy was taken over. The Occupy movement was taken over with a template for their trained activists worldwide, holding what they call general assemblies with trained facilitators using the government infiltrators. Basically, they drained away the funds and disempowered the real voices in a matter of weeks. That was done very skillfully by no more than 5 people. So this is how infiltration works. These are counterintelligence techniques directly from the Intelligence Services Handbook. And we've also published that slideshow, which was released several years ago, which was a GCHQ slideshow on how to control the narrative. So see our shows on government organised protests. That was interesting, wasn't it? How the Women's March was actually co-opted into another Soros Women's March, which had nothing to do with women marching. But it had everything to do with demonising Trump and pushing climate change. And many of the people on that march, in fact, I would say most of them, and they were interviewed by many people, did not have a clue what they were doing there. And this is this new form of activism. So this is straight out of the handbook of basically these organisations. It comes down through the UN. The UN train change agents, and they openly do so. And you can become a UN change agent. Just Google that and they will tell you how to do it. Of course, you have to push the global warming conspiracy theory to be part of it. So the useful idiots of the state are programmed into the acceptable subversion agenda and employ repetition, ad hominem attacks and gang stalking. And now this is actually something that's really interesting because we hear about this gang stalking, but it's been going on for years. Because anyone who doesn't actually comply with these groups will be gang stalked, usually on social media, but sometimes it can get much worse. And this is all state-sponsored, by the way, and it's sponsored by people like, obviously, Soros' Open Society, and we've talked about that before. But, so we've got this gang stalking of anyone that they have been programmed to hate. Basically, this hate speak thing is really interesting. They're using hate speech as the excuse for their counterattacks. Now, the population is subverted into agendas and distracted with issues of no importance, which will divide and rule them. This is one of the strategies of basically KGB-style infiltration. The Global Action Plan needs leaders, and leaders are trained and mentored into the programme. The main programme is that of climate activism, and the globalists need these climate change protesters very, very badly at the moment. Now, the UN train change agents, as we said, and mentor them into the draconian principles of Agenda 21 and now Agenda 2030. This sustainable development programme is behind the housing crisis, which is manufactured to make homes unaffordable, the increasing police state and austerity. These are all visioning of what the UN are putting out. These are all the visions of the UN. This is what it's really all about. Sustainable development is absolutely the opposite. So the stack and pack overpriced minuscule flats being sold for fortunes are all about control and rationing. The smart cities of Agenda 2030 are the prisons for populations who will be worked, taxed and demised when they are no longer able to feed energy into holding up taxation. So those mentored into the programme will give up their rights willingly by consent for some greater good or be co-opted through attacks by agents of the state. Now, Saul Alinsky became the poster boy of all this in 2010 through David Cameron, of course Obama in America, and this approach was infiltration from within. That's one of the things that Saul Alinsky advocated, was infiltration from within. In 2010, David Cameron actually put this out into the public domain. One of the change agent groups called Unlimited stated that the result of the cuts would be one of anger, the degree of which was yet to be realised, and the idea of the big society was to galvanise that energy before it could take hold. And that's what we're seeing with the infiltration and subversion of every kind of basically every organisation in the country, and this is what I hear from people all over the place. So Britain's under ideological subversion by change agents in the public and the private sector. The intelligence services are now working against the democratic principles which many still think are peculiar to the UK. So the word democracy is what most people use to describe what they believe to be the role of government, and this role to serve the public no longer applies. We have covered how all protests, including Occupy, the People's Assembly, the Women's March and any other mass organised event, are all carefully organised by the interests who control the narrative on behalf of the puppets in Parliament, backed by multinational corporations and global banking interests. And we've proved that with our recent programmes, and also if you look at that Women's March and what we said about that, who it was backed by, the banking interests that financed it, it was basically a corporate agenda and takeover, as is the People's Assembly. It's a day out for the masses, so nobody gets hurt. They are given their placards to carry and they are sent home again afterwards. So there's nothing wrong with that as long as people know that that's what's happening, that they're not having actually any input which could be of any use to them. So the Orwellian language used to promote the soundbite rebellion under sustainable development, diversity, empowerment, visioning, and of course the climate change agenda, which is the glue which holds all policy to restrict freedom and tax the population to their willing demise, was all planned before the Rio Earth Summit in '92. And this is one of the things that we talk about in our shows, the bigger picture. So listen to our show The Fourth Way from a couple of weeks ago, where global sponsors of climate catastrophobia, including Edmund de Rothschild and Maurice Strong, they're involved in that show, and we use their direct quotes, and we have voice recordings of Edmund de Rothschild suggesting spraying dry ice at the North Pole to cool it down. He must have had a good laugh in the bar about that one afterwards. So the promoted anti-globalists are the instrument of the globalists. This is the main thrust of this show. So the promoted anti-globalists are the instrument of the globalists. This makes sense as they are idealists, and many do not have much idea of what to do unless they are led. So leaders have to be trained to lead them, and it all has to be paid for. So the fake activism groups promote idiots, promote the useful idiots, and they get those which may rebel against the agenda arrested and drain real organisations of money and attack anyone who may be genuine. This is very important because they need to shut down opposition within the group. I saw this happen directly at Occupy and many other places since. The controlled opposition then needs somewhere to protest, so they are led to a place where they can be controlled and surveilled easily, as in Parliament Square recently. Someone has to guide them and someone has to supply the movements with money. We've reported on this from Soros and the Open Society. There flows hundreds of fake activism groups to bring about the change which is talked about. The global governors and the UN. The funded activist groups are easy to spot. They work to a template and deal in easy to repeat sound bites which are not even real slogans but empty rhetoric. And they have no proof to their claims and do not need them. They need leaders, so leaders are trained. These leaders, I've seen how they're trained, and we've been up close with them, we've been attacked by them. They have a very limited ideology which they use against you. So the psychology of control is a science which has been perfected from gaining perceived public support for wars, taxation, power grabs by the state, and divide and rule strategies which have been in the main very effective in keeping the population subdued, confused and disempowered. So the latest in a series of fake activist organisations following Occupy, Climate Camp, Reclaim the Power, then the banner organisation, the People's Assembly, and Anonymous, and now we have Extinction Rebellion, a template call to action using 3 tenets of Agenda 2030 and the Global Action Plan, the latest globalist recruitment ideology for useful idiots. They also advocate breaking the law, which is a good way to make sure that those who may want to step out of line will not be able to do so again. So the cannon fodder for the Global Action Plan, the Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis and synthesis. So we have thesis, antithesis, create synthesis. Everyone will be made to accept enslavement by a mob who will be taught to work against their own interests. That's the final revolution. And that's what they're promoting. The recent front line for the infiltrators who took over Occupy is now fracking, and the cardboard cutout protesters are now full on promoting climate catastrophobia, the smart agenda and the Internet of Things, and phasing out what is termed as fossil fuels completely. They're making way for rationing, martial law and the police state. So the latest fake activist Soros agenda puppetry is called Extinction Rebellion. Now I'm going to play you their audio, which will tell you a lot about the sound bites that they're using. So here we are. This is their rebellion declaration.
We all think of it as something big that's looming in the future, that there's things that as humans, that when we get to it, we'll be able to cope with it when and if it happens, whereas the reality is we're sleepwalking into a catastrophe.
We are organising a rebellion
against the UK government
for their criminal inaction
on mass species extinction
and climate breakdown.
This means civil disobedience
and peaceful law breaking,
with 3 key demands.
To declare a climate emergency,
to communicate the crisis with the public,
to go zero carbon by 2025.
We are calling for the creation
of a National Assembly
to vote
on our way out of the crisis.
Ordinary people
making informed decisions
about our future
through a system known as sortition.
The time for hope is over.
We need courage.
We are acting because it's the right thing to do.
Help us to organise a talk and direct action training in your area.
Join us for a declaration of rebellion
in London on the 31st of October
and November the 17th
in Parliament Square.
We are so very nearly
out of time.
Help us
to do what is right.
So there you go. Get down to Parliament Square, lie in the road and stop climate change. So climate change is going to be stopped by people lying in the road. And there's a video of them doing it. And we're going to get into the whole kind of agenda around this new incarnation of fakery, which was exactly the same template as they took over Occupy, basically whose sweets are sweets, all the rest of it, the stupid repetitive mantras that they all repeat. It's exactly the template of what happened with Occupy, Reclaim the Power, all of these fake rebellion things that were set up. They know that they don't need to change this because it's a template. They have facilitators, they have general assemblies, and they have a predicted outcome. Well, look at your local council meeting. It's the same thing. So They're trying to get people arrested and are stating we have 12 years to save the world. Well, we better get busy then, hadn't we? One of the drones states that in order to stop climate change, they need to sit in a road. Their spokesman is a 15-year-old. No, seriously, their spokesman is a 15-year-old with Asperger's called Greta Thunberg from Sweden. And Sweden is the totalitarian communist country. I mean, this is absolutely incredible stuff. Now, I want to play you their Extinction Rebellion declaration because it features Greta.
So everyone out there,
It is now time for civil disobedience.
it is now time for civil disobedience.
It is time to rebel.
It is time to rebel.
There's a great tradition of civil disobedience in Britain and throughout the world, and I think that's what it's going to take to make the changes that we need to make to stop climate change.
We are the stories revolution comes from, and we will rise.
It's in the UK.
Well, there you go. What we need to do is lie in the road and listen to 15-year-olds to save the world. So, yes, their spokesman there was spokesperson. It's a 15-year-old with Asperger's, Greta Thunberg from Sweden. And Greta protested outside Sweden's parliament and has now been adopted by the globalists to do their bidding. Now, those pushing this child, in my view, are guilty of at least cynically exploiting her, even if she believes what she is saying. Remember that this is a child with Asperger's, and that's basically their own description of her. So she decided never to fly again or eat meat after being programmed with the climate change agenda, which is exactly what the Agenda 2030 principles are all about. Nobody will be allowed to move anywhere, and flying will be basically a luxury for globalists. So she's enforcing a police state on people. So we've got a 15-year-old enforcing the police state agenda of the UN. Pretty cynical. She states that adults do not understand climate change. So a 15-year-old is stating that adults don't understand climate change.
Well, that's fortunate.
Well, what do you think about that, Mr. Corbyn?
Well, it's a good thing they don't understand climate change, i.e. the climate change false agenda. However, the child is not completely correct because quite a large proportion of the population do believe it, and it is utter lies.
Yes, let's carry on with this. She states that when we think about the future today, we do not think beyond 2050. Now, who put that into a minuscule but highly active brain? Because 2050 is when the UN want everyone living in surveilled smart cities with nobody living in the country. So this child is basically, in my view, been abused because she's actually, they put ideas into her head. They're taking complete advantage of her.
No, it's really utterly cynical. But then, of course, the UN agenda and all people attached to it are utterly cynical people. That they pretend or they believe they're working for a redistribution of wealth for the world, which actually is an increased theft level by Wall Street and the super rich.
Yeah. So instead of state programming by staying off school, she decided to skip school and sit in front of Parliament. So basically, they're advocating truancy as well for 15-year-olds, which I think is against the law in Sweden, right? So ironically, it was her teacher who programmed her into skipping school by programming her with the Global Action Plan.
Her parents won't be arrested. They'll all be
let's get to her parents
allowed.
now, Piers. Her father is now a climate change globalist lobbyist writing articles on climate change.
Right.
And her mother...
And who pays him?
Well, let's find out. Her mother is an opera singer, and she stopped flying, all thanks to Greta. So basically, got a 15-year-old who's ruined her own parents' lives. So lobbyists who, basically she's cut off the actual the income stream for her schooling. by the sound of it.
So it's probably a state school, though, isn't it?
Yeah. But the point is that.
The income stream for her bread and butter.
Yeah. Well, it'd be funny if she
liked sausages, she'd be in a big difficulty right
That's right. Lobbyists who support her truancy are encouraging more kids to skip school. So they're advocating truancy, which again is against the law. So in other words, they're inviting the social services in. You know, so this is classic Soviet-style propaganda. This sounds like a good excuse for the social services to intervene, except she's been cynically used by the globalists, who have no problem using vulnerable young people with a publicly stated diagnosed behavioural disorder to advance their Agenda 2030 Sustainable Prison State Global Action Plan. Now, the website that pushes a lot of this is called We Don't Have Time.org. Read that and weep, probably with laughter. And they're using her as a tool to promote the Prison Planet agenda. Now, their website states that the Earth is warming, severely disrupting the conditions for life and society. So they start out with an absolute pack of lies and a complete load of stupid nonsense. They state that climate change is caused by human activities, energy production, deforestation, food production and transportation. Well, there you go. They carry on with further lies and nonsense, and in a recent article, get this. 15-year-old Greta Thunberg sits down outside the Swedish Parliament every day until the Swedish election for the climate. Here is her own strong and apprehensive text about the climate crisis and our ineptitude to deal with it. Here's what Greta had to say. I want to feel safe. When I walk home late at night, when I sit on the subway, when I sleep at night, but I don't feel safe. How am I supposed to feel safe when I know that we are facing the most acute crisis in the history of mankind? When I know that if we don't act now, everything will soon be too late. The first time I heard about global warming, I thought that can't be right. Oh, she started off on the right track, but they must have done something to her. So I thought that can't be right. No way there is something serious enough to threaten our very existence. Well, she was correct, wasn't she?
Yeah. But what will happen to this kid who she's brainwashed, right?
Yeah.
In 5 or 10 years' time, like 2030, when we're in the midst of a new, more than minimum, of super cold and ice all over parts of Sweden, she might realise that she was brainwashed, and then what will happen to her?
Then
what will she do?
Well, maybe
what will she say about all these people that have?
Well, I think the state will intervene as it should, in its usual way, and they have ways of dealing with that. You know, it's for the greater good. The common good has to prevail.
But you know, it is really sad, really, what's been done here.
It's very sad. Yeah. And she carries on, because otherwise we would not be talking about anything else. As soon as you turn on the TV, everything would be about this issue. Headlines, radio, newspaper. Yeah. I wonder what channel she's watching. Yeah, you would never read or hear about anything else, as if a world war was raging. But in fact, no one was talking. And if they did, it was never in line with the scientists' statements. You can tell that she hasn't said this, right?
No scientist statements, because the IPCC is run by government appointees, and the real scientific input is suppressed.
So we've now go on to the next stage. The other day, I watched a debate between party leaders on TV and saw how they were allowed to stand there and lie. Well, that's an introduction to politics. That's what they do all day long, Greta. You know, I'm sorry. I know you're a bit young to grasp this, but they lie on...
she's lying, but she doesn't know it.
Yeah, no, she's been used to lie on their behalf.
A lot of these politicians lie, but they don't know it. You know what I mean? They're busy people. They get sent a script by somebody. A speech has been written for them, and they read it.
See, the thing is that they've already got draconian emissions standards in Sweden. So she's saying they said it made no sense to make an effort to curb Sweden's emissions since we were such a role model, that we should focus on helping other countries to cut their emissions.
Instead of their own.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. Well, since for every power station they turn down or stop in Sweden or Europe, there's about 50 others being made in China. So the whole thing is utterly deranged. It's an ideological attack on everybody to corral them into whatever they want.
Absolutely right. It is an ideological attack. It carries on. We are facing an unprecedented global emergency. Our children and our nation face grave risk. The planet is in ecological crisis. We are in the midst of the sixth mass... wait a minute, Piers. I want to get your opinion on this. We are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction event this planet has experienced. This is news to me.
It is. It's poppycock. I mean, by some mass extinctions, they mean questions like, would the dinosaurs died out? That was a mass extinction. Why did they die out? Well, I don't know. There's all sorts of questions. And there's been other mass extinctions due to meteorite things.
Exactly, that's what I was going to get to. I mean, a meteorite fell in Argentina a while ago, and the crater was absolutely huge.
Yeah.
And these things are natural.
Of course.
And they're occurring, and they have occurred for hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, my view is, in studying this, I mean, I want to bow to Greta's greater kind of knowledge on this, but the point is that we've got some very strange noises coming through there. But the point is that the extinctions that seem to have happened after the Great Flood and before it, there have been extinctions on parts of the planet, and it seems to tie into cometary catastrophe and huge meteorites.
For example, they were most likely those sort of things. By huge meteorites, you mean like something half the size of the moon hitting Gulf of Mexico or something?
Yes.
I mean, really big events, but they will happen again. They have happened and will happen again. But I don't think Greta's parents driving cars around too fast in Oslo is having an iota of effect on anything whatsoever in terms of climate. And this girl is brainwashed and utterly deluded.
Climate truancy, that's what it is. And that's what they're encouraging. So let's have a look at I'm going to have to get rid of this because just drop that call. Because we've got Sandy waiting on the line, but we seem to be getting some very kind of early 60s type weird effects coming on, like, it sounds like an edition of Star Trek or something.
Well, perhaps MI6 are trying to tell us something.
I always thought it was MFI, but they went bust, didn't they? But anyway, their website, this is the Extinction Rebellion. Their website
Who
states...
funds this thing? I mean,
well, I think we're looking at the sort of Soros type thing, but...
Who funds George Monbiot? Is that Soros as well?
Well, he was there at the climate extinction rally.
Mm-hmm.
And
he's liable to be, he's been on TVs or radios or whatever saying that I'm a bad weather forecaster.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this here. It's from their website, which states, "Hope dies, action begins. From Occupy to Extinction Rebellion, exposing the common purpose." Now I'm going to bring in a lady who I've been in contact with a long time, Frances Leader. This is the title of her latest article, which is, in my opinion, spot on. She stated in this article, "From Occupy to Extinction Rebellion," and Frances has been involved in most of the protests which people will know about in their lifetimes, because she's going to tell us where she's learned all this stuff from when she comes on the show. But she was very involved, obviously, in Occupy and also onwards, and put some great points into this article. Frances has written this article, "From Occupy to Extinction Rebellion," exposing the new common purpose. She states, "The new group Extinction Rebellion is another incarnation of Climate Camp and Reclaim the Power. They make money by selling activist courses to innocent people. They are astroturfists, fake grassroots, and their style comes from the Tavistock Institute or Common Purpose Leadership Training." Now, Common Purpose train future leaders. There are many of these organisations who train future leaders. Common Purpose is probably one of the best known ones. Now, she carries on, "These are the controllers who steer real activists into illegal activities so that they get arrested, a police record, and never get a decent job again. Avoid them. Under the Reclaim the Power branding, these people have been very disruptive to the anti-fracking movement for 5 years." Frances' article then goes on to describe the subversion and infiltration of the group by these subversive cuckoos, and she goes into exactly what's been happening on the fracking protests there. And what I'm going to do is get Frances on to talk about this, but she does state that George Monbiot, columnist at The Guardian, was one of the speakers at the declaration of Extinction Rebellion. So yes, we know that he was there. Now, what do you think of this so far, Piers? Because I'm going to try and get Frances on the phone now.
Well, there is a valid point to protest against fracking from damaging the water system.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the role of these people is... Well, it effectively disrupts effective protest. That's one thing it does, but the reason for it is nothing to do with fracking as such. which is, in my opinion, the issue is water. It's to make more and more propaganda about so-called man-made climate change, which, as you said correctly earlier, is the glue which holds together the false ideologies of the narrative for globalism.
Now we've got Francis on the phone. Francis, can you hear us? We've got a slight delay there in the background, and we can hear the radio in the background. Are you there, Francis?
Yes.
You are. Can you turn us off in the background, please?
Yes. Yes, I can.
That's great. Yeah, what you seem to be doing is playing us in the background. Has that gone off? Yeah, that's great. Okay, can you hear us now, Francis?
I can hear you loud and clear. Hi, Mark.
Fantastic.
That's great. So, I've done quite a long intro to tonight's show because I thought it was necessary. First of all, can you give us a bit of your background in the activism and what you've been doing? Because you're very knowledgeable about how all this works, aren't you?
That's great. So,
yes. Crikey. We'd be here all night if I were to tell you everything, but I'll just give you the basic bones. I was 15 in 1967, and there were anti-Vietnam rallies going on in London outside the American embassy, and I bunked the trains, and I got there, and I took part, and I haven't stopped since. I've been involved with just about every anti-war movement, every ecological movement, particularly Animal Liberation Front, Stop the City, and then I went to Spain for about 5 years, and went up a mountain and ran a fruit farm. And I came back in 2008 because of the financial crash, came back to the UK, and was immediately ill as soon as I got back into the UK. I thought that because I'd been up a mountain in Spain drinking spring water from snowmelt and eating very fresh food, I thought to begin with that was a physical shock from a change to a very toxic environment. But it didn't really end there. I was really poorly, and I realised that the country's in a bit of a bad way. Poisoned, I felt everything was poisoned, and I was having an awful lot of trouble with getting what I considered to be clean food. And when I realised that glyphosate was being sprayed on the wheat everywhere in order to desiccate it before harvest, therefore that was giving me stomach problems, and I had to cut all wheat products out of my diet. And
now this is interesting, Francis, because it's something that we don't hear from these what I would call fake protest groups, is the things that actually really matter. And you've witnessed this kind of infiltration. And we talked earlier today about this. We haven't spoken for quite some time, but we're in general concurrence that a lot of those sort of fake protesters, the ones we presume are paid by the state, who are doing the state's bidding, went into basically take over and disrupt the fracking protests. And this new Extinction rebellion appears to be a similar kind of takeover. Can you tell us about that? Because you wrote your article's brilliant.
Thank you very much. It did take me quite some time to write. The experience I had was at Borkum. The first experience with the anti-fracking was at Borkum in 2013, and to begin with, it was just a few activists building a camp, and it grew, and then suddenly we were literally invaded by Reclaim the Power, and they set up a satellite camp for 1 weekend only, and the action that they took by invading our camp and literally filling up the road with thousands of people caused a massive increase in policing, and they overwhelmed us. We were the genuine activists, and they were taking all the attention away from us to such an extent that when they departed, I went into the nearby village to get some more bottles of gas for our cooker, and the guy in the shop said, "Oh, I thought you'd all gone. I heard in the paper that you've all gone." And that's what they did. They came for one weekend, departed, and left us to continue with the protest for the next, I think it was another 6 weeks after that, because it was 3 months in all, and on our own, with being seriously over-policed, and the number of arrests that were going on was outrageous. It was really outrageous.
Yeah.
The worst of it was I was the treasurer of the Balkan camp, and the worst thing that happened to me was after the whole thing was over and done with, and believe me, I was absolutely exhausted by the end of that 3 months. I got home and I was getting online and putting up photographs and reports and everything, and I was trundling along quite happily, and then all of a sudden I was accused of having received £20,000 profit from the Reclaim the Power training courses and food that they had been selling on site. And I didn't know anything about this, and I was so I tried to get in touch with them, and I kept hitting brick walls. I could not seem to get in touch with anyone that was an actual organiser of Reclaim the Power that could clear my name and say, this is rubbish, this hasn't happened.
So she was set up.
And
yeah. This is, Piers said, so you were set up. Yes, this is how they operate. And I saw this firsthand with that Occupy and how that was taken over. And this is a carbon copy. It's the same thing. The stupid mantras that they're repeating, it's kind of like a kind of Clockwork Orange type thing, really. And also, this is an interesting one, Francis, I was going to ask you about, because in your article, you referred to the Tranquility Team. Now, tell us what the Tranquility Team do.
Well, when I was curious enough to go and visit the camp, when we had a quiet day, I drove onto the camp, no problem, got through the gate, no problem, their camp, the RTP camp I'm talking about. I got out of my car and I walked through the campsite, and it was surprisingly huge and surprisingly well fitted out. I passed a kitchen that was very well fitted out, and that had a price list of all the meals that were available, which upset me a bit, because they had come and asked us for contributions to their food from our supplies, which had all been donated by members of the public living round and about the area. So what they had done was taken our supplies, and then they were making a profit from them. That upset me, so I backed out of there, didn't speak to anyone, and carried on walking down the camp. And I went into the doorway of a large tent, and they were having a session in there that was more or less teaching people how to be activists. And I honestly, I had to laugh, really, because, you know, you can't be teaching people how to be activists.
Well, they're teaching people how to fit into this narrow corridor which they want to promote, and that's all it is. What happened with the Occupy was very interesting, because it turned into pointless sloganeering by change agents. And it's amazing how these people take over. Now, this Extinction rebellion, it's absolutely absurd, but it's taken hold. And there's a lot of people out there putting this banner, which is basically like, it looks like some kind of runic symbol, but I think it's meant to be a timer, like an egg timer. So basically saying, we haven't got enough time to save the world. And so it's just the same thing again and again and again. But there's no creativity in this kind of rollout. They just keep on doing it, and they're training people into it. And that's what I think is the most powerful thing for the public to know, that this is a template of absolute unoriginality. they just keep doing the same thing. And using this kid, I think, is extremely cynical. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I have. I was really horrified. But you asked me about the Tranquility Team, and I didn't explain to you that on every Reclaim the Power camp that I have seen, and I've seen a few, they have these groups of people that are called the Tranquility Team, and their job is to get rid of anybody that they don't think is following their line of narrative. And I had not spoken to a soul, so they had no way of knowing anything about me. But they hustled me off of that camp as fast as they could, this Tranquility Team, which was two big, beefy guys who were very determined that I was going to leave immediately.
I like the way they call it Tranquility. It's very Clockwork Orange, because I saw them at Occupy. I mean, I think we're at the Bank of Ideas, and someone
they were anything but tranquil.
It's 1984 doublespeak.
It's doublespeak, yeah. It's absolute doublespeak.
They were thugs.
Not just that, but if that Tranquility Team does not succeed, as was the case with a young guy called Darren Nesbitt at a Lancashire Reclaim the Power event, he, his wife, his kids, his friends and their kids were all camped, all set up, having a lovely time. All of a sudden, they were literally ganged up on. A massive gang, I'm talking more than 20 people, surrounded them and drove them off until the kids were in tears. They are far from tranquil. They are very threatening, and their methods...
Well, they're Nazi methods, aren't they?
Sorry?
It's like Nazi methods.
Yes, very. You are not acceptable to them unless you are part of their way of thinking.
So this template is rolled out again and again and again, because the Tranquility thing was all part of Occupy, and that's exactly what they did. And they also use people called dragons who stand around you and shout in your face. We did a film called The Puppet Masters of Occupy, which you can find on YouTube. We did a follow-up called The Puppet Masters of Occupy Revisited, when the eviction happened. And then this is at St Paul's, by the way, in the UK, the Occupy St Paul's, which was turned from criticising the financial system to climate change very quickly. And we know that the money that was donated to Occupy was put into a bank account of an organisation called Climate Camp, which we traced back to a lot of other sort of organisations based in a place in Hackney. And people don't realise that these controlled opposition groups absolutely control the narrative of protest in this country, and that's what I wanted to get over with this show. So in conclusion for this part of the show, because I think we'll carry on, what would you say to people who are thinking or are indeed involved in this Extinction rebellion?
I would say that far from, I think one of their favourite phrases is sleepwalking into extinction. I've heard them say. I would say no, we're not sleepwalking into extinction. We're sleepwalking into genocide. These things that are happening that make it look like climate change are faked. They are entirely created by geoengineering, and it is quite insidious, deliberate, and the object of it is to have us all like rabbits in headlights, so terrified, especially this latest IPCC business.
The SR15, yeah, we've covered that, yeah.
That's absolutely terrorising. They are terrorising the people into believing this narrative so that the people become compliant with Agendas 21 and 2030.
That's exactly right, and we cover that in the talks, The Bigger Picture. We actually explain how all of this is co-opted in, and I think Piers wants to say something now.
Yes, I do, Francis. That was extremely interesting what you had to say, and well done. The timing, of course, of the event in Parliament Square on the 17th of November is very convenient, just after the IPCC report, which is happening on November the 14th in the Westminster Hall, number 1, Victoria Street, where they're going to have a big rally in the a half-day rally where they're going to propagate all the biggest lies around. I'm sure it's going to get huge publicity from the BBC, and it's there to build up into frenzy, to have people turning up in Parliament Square and probably some people getting arrested and so on, to raise the temperature, so to speak, of the fake climate change story.
Can I add something?
Yes, absolutely.
I have a friend who is in Australia who is listening to this programme right now. She sent me a message just this moment, and I'd like to read it to you. She says, this global warming shit is about money grabbing.
Yep.
And above all, to keep the population busy thinking about global warming, thinking that they are being informed and engaged, while the real shit goes down unnoticed.
Yeah, that's absolutely
And
correct.
I think that there are people all around the world that are aware of this, that this is happening. But as we've been saying, especially what Mark was saying in the introduction, all forms of protest are being controlled and overtaken. It's like the minute you start to protest about anything, like we did at Balkan, there's this big spider comes along and
disrupts you,
jumps on top of you and controls you, and it's worse by
False
far than the
friends.
police.
No, that is very insightful. On the point about mass genocide, effectively, is what you're talking about. We should point out that even the World Health Organization, part of the United Nations, has pointed out that millions of people die every year through fuel poverty and energy poverty, most of which, of course, is caused by the increases in fuel and energy prices due to the climate change story. So, they're already part of a process of killing people. And the walking into extinction is a complete nonsense thing. I mean, we're not going to stop the next, massive asteroid hitting the Earth whenever it does happen. I mean, by lying in the street or getting arrested in Parliament Square.
Exactly, and that's going to be a natural phenomenon, as most of this stuff really is when you look at it. And again, it's rather tiresome to have to look at people being hoodwinked again and again and again and again with the same old template. And once you look at these templates, they are all the same. I mean, the repetitive mantras that they're saying, we demand a sustainable future. We demand a sustainable future. Whose sweets? Our sweets. All the rest of it. That's exactly what they did with Occupy. They make them repeat it to sound like children. And in this case, they must be having the last laugh because it's being run by a child. It's amazing. I mean, you've got to hand it to Edmund de Rothschild, because he actually got up with a straight face at that Fourth World Conference in the Rio Earth Summit 1992, and he said, we're going to put some dry ice in the North Pole to cool it down. Yeah. In the bar, they must have been having a laugh, and he must have been dining out on that one for weeks, probably years. Yeah. It's incredible.
Wasn't that Rockefeller who said that?
No, it was Rothschild, Edmund de Rothschild.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, we played it in our show, The Fourth World, last week.
Well, Rockefeller would have gone along with it, so it's...
Oh, yes.
I know that Rockefeller had a few choice things to say at that event as well. So what you're saying effectively is since 1992, everything has been more or less directed towards us becoming global citizens and having our news and information completely narrowed down to this selected narrative, which is a lie from start to finish.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. The narrow corridor of accepted opinion has never been narrower, and those enforcing it have never been more vociferous. And also, it's happening in every single aspect of what we call society. I get this from people all over the country. That's why we've become a bit expert on it, only for the reason that we've found the same template everywhere. They put in their change agents, they take over, they control the narrative, and they basically libel and abuse anybody outside of their agenda. And that agenda is the globalist agenda, and it's the change that we do not want to see. It's the change they talk about, and the change they talk about is this UN Global Action Plan implemented at a local level, which we cover on the bigger picture. And I'm just going to give Francis the last word now. Have you got anything else you want to say just before we wrap this section of the show?
Yes, you've just talked about how they abuse people. It's far worse than that, far more sinister than you've described. I know of 3 people in the anti-fracking movement who have been sectioned. They've been arrested on the site, and then they have been sectioned and chemically koshed. They get put into a nut house, and they get force-fed medication. So if you do not follow this narrative, this climate change narrative, and do your rebellion in the way they want the rebellion done, you will be chemically koshed. That is the truth. That is what is actually happening. It's far, far worse, far more sinister than just character assassinating you on Facebook or laughing at you. No, this gets very serious. 3 people have already experienced that in the last few months.
Yes, we have covered that on previous shows, and even when I was at the People's Voice, we had a chap who got sectioned for handing in a document at Charing Cross Hospital where he was an electrician. And this stuff does happen. I got phoned several weeks ago from someone inside a secure mental institution, and this use of the sectioning is quite disturbing, which is why everyone now has to be fully aware of what they're getting drawn into, and be fully aware of their rights, and be fully aware of being able to articulate themselves properly, because that is the state taking control of the narrative, ultimately sectioning people. And basically, once you're in one of those institutions, it can be very hard to get out unless you have a lot of support and access to very big media channels. So that's very good advice. And yes, in conclusion for this part of the show, we're going to carry on. We're going to have a 5-minute break and come back at 10 past, and we're going to wrap this part of the show. But I'm going to give the last few minutes to Piers. What have you got to say about all this?
Well, very interesting stuff. I would say that, we have to get to grips more and more with, what amounts now, we're going to talk about, the anniversary of the Great War in the second half, but what we have now is like a kind of new world war, if you like, of the people against the masters of super profit and the super rich in Wall Street. Because you see, the direct result of the climate change story is to increase energy prices and limit choices in the developing world. And even Bjorn Lomborg recently pointed out that the implementation of these plans is making more world poverty. Now, the consequence of world poverty is increasing richness of the super rich and the top people on the global ladder, namely the Wall Street biggest corporations. And far from, they say, redistributing wealth, well, they're not redistributing wealth downwards, they're redistributing wealth upwards. And the 0.1% of the population that own most of the world now own an even bigger proportion of the world. Not a smaller proportion, a bigger proportion. So all these things that people are drawn into believing are working against what a lot of them think they are working for. So the answer has to be, well, understand and organise and demand accountability at every level from all official bodies.
That's very good advice, and we're going to come back with part 2. So we're going to sign off now. Thanks a lot to Francis in the first half. We're going to talk to Sandy in the second half. That's it for this part of the show. We'll be back on air in 10 minutes from now at 10 past the hour.